Hi everyone. It's really nice to be here, or maybe not to be here. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for organising this. This is really wonderful. And I'm sorry I'm not there in person. This is a talk called The Mesh. It's based on an idea from one of the two main ideas of my new book, The Ecological Thought, which is the prequel to Ecology Without Nature. I think that for some various different reasons, maybe just because I don't have enough RAM in my brain, I couldn't think the ecological thought until I'd written Ecology Without Nature, but I think maybe, possibly not. There's a rigorous reason why the ecological thought is a sort of emergent politics and philosophy at the moment, and so in some ways it's not yet fully thinkable, so I think it does have to follow the first project. Anyway, this is The Mesh, and it starts with this question: what is interdependence? Let's imagine a theorem called the interdependence theorem. The interdependence theorem contains two simple axioms. Axiom 1 states that for every A, the existence of A is such that A consists of things that are not A. In other words, A is made of not A, such that the only way to define it is negatively and differentially. Thus, A is A because it isn't not A, while not A is only not A because it is not A. So A and not A are mutually determining. Axiom 1 states that things are only what they are in relation to other things. Axiom 2 states that things derive from other things. While Axiom 1 is concerned with how things are, synchronically, Axiom 2 talks about origins, diachrony. In every case, things like A only exist such that a not A exists. Nothing exists by itself, and nothing comes from nothing. Axioms 1 and 2 define interdependence across a range of phenomena. They summarize structural linguistics, for instance, because structuralism's model of language is that signs are completely interdependent. The interdependence theorem also describes life forms. Diachronically, no life form exists that didn't arise from another life form, and synchronically, life forms are different from each other in arbitrarily negative ways. There's no human-flavoured DNA as opposed to daffodil-flavoured DNA, for instance. We all know that, or we should know now, that humans are 98% chimp. Human DNA is 98% chimp, but also 35% daffodil. Wordsworth, eat your heart out. So, since life forms are expressions of DNA, they in fact differ from each other negatively rather than positively, since DNA is of course a language and thus can be modelled by structuralism. Since life forms depend upon each other the same way signs depend upon each other, the system of life forms is isometric with the system of language. This means that since language as a system is subject to deconstruction, the system of life forms must also be subject to deconstruction. What happens when we subject the system of life forms to deconstruction? Let's remind ourselves what happens when we subject the system of language to deconstruction. Derrida describes this as thinking the structurality of structure. What kind of structure? It's open-ended, it has no centre and no edge. Because language is an arbitrary system of negative difference, there's no sign that stands somehow outside the system to guarantee the meaning and stability of the other signs. This means language is infinite, in the strong sense that we can never fully account for its meanings or effects. It also means that meaning depends upon meaninglessness, and that language as a system isn't a thing, not an object, but a strange infinite network that has neither inside nor outside. The process that makes signs manifest as appearance and meaning is différance, the process of difference, synchronic, and deferment, diachronic. The meaning of a word is another word, and strings of signs only gain significance retroactively. The meaning of a sentence is a moving target. You'll never be able to know exactly what the end of this sentence is until after you've heard it. Elephant. This means that coherence, in order to be coherence, must contain some incoherence. We can apply exactly the same view to the system of life forms. Life forms are made up of other life forms, the theory of symbiosis, and life forms derive from other life forms, evolution. It's so simple, and yet so profound. Because of the ecological emergency we have entered, we are now compelled to take account of this mind-changing view. The implications of a deconstructive view of life forms are manifold. 1. Life forms constitute a mesh that is infinite and beyond concept, unthinkable as such. 2. Tracing the origins of life to a moment prior to life will result in paradoxes. 3. Drawing distinctions between life and non-life is strictly impossible, yet unavoidable. 4. Differentiating one species and another is never absolute. 5. There's no outside of the system of life forms. 6. The interdependence theorem is part of the system of interdependence, and thus subject to deconstruction. And 7. Since we cannot know in advance what the effects of the system will be, all life forms are theorizable as strange strangers. So let's sift through these implications. 1. Life forms constitute a mesh that is infinite and beyond concept, unthinkable as such. This isn't just because the mesh is too large, but also because it is also infinitesimally small. Differentiation goes down to the genomic level. There is no human-flavoured DNA, no daffodil-flavoured DNA. Most of the words that I thought of to describe this were compromised by references to the internet, network, for example. Either that or they were compromised by vitalism, the belief in a living substance. Web is a little bit too vitalist, and a little bit internetish too, so I guess it loses on both counts. Mesh can mean both the holes in a network and the threading between them. It suggests both hardness and delicacy. It has uses in biology, mathematics, and engineering, and in weaving and computing. Think stockings and graphic design, metals and fabrics. It has antecedents in mask and in mass, suggesting both density and deception. By extension, mesh can mean, and I'm quoting the OED here, a complex situation or series of events in which a person is entangled, a concatenation of constraining or restricting forces or circumstances, a snare. In other words, it's perfect. If everything is interconnected, then there's no definite background and therefore no definite foreground. Charles Darwin sensed this via thinking through the implications of the theory of natural selection. You can feel his palpable amazement in the quotation there, which I'm not going to read. Every single life form is literally familiar in that we are genetically descended from them. Darwin imagines an endlessly branching tree. Mesh doesn't suggest a clear starting point, and those clusters of subordinate groups in the quotation above are far from linear. They cannot be ranked in a single file. Each point of the mesh is both the centre and edge of a system of points, so there is no absolute centre or edge. Still, the tree image marvellously closes out Darwin's chapter on natural selection with its evocation of the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. A ramification is a branch, and an implication, a branching thought, so it's thinking and living at the same time. 2. Tracing the origins of life to a moment prior to life will result in paradoxes. Sol Spiegelman's discoveries concerning RNA show how you can't draw a rigid, narrow boundary between life and non-life. In order for life forms to begin, there had to be a strange, paradoxical, pre-living life made of RNA and self-replicating crystals, possibly silicate crystals. How strange that silicon is the element in question. So in a way, your great-great-great-grandmother was indeed a robot, as Daniel Dennett says. RNA world abolishes the idea of a palpable, fetishized life substance, the sort nature philosophy imagines as Urschleim, a kind of sentient gel. Curiously, the fantasy thing of idealist biology turns out to be this existential substance, as if idealism depended for its coherence on some metaphysical materiality. RNA world, by contrast, is structured like a language. At bottom, it's a set of empty formal relationships. This is the basis of a genuinely materialist biology. 3. Drawing distinctions between life and non-life is strictly impossible, yet unavoidable. This brings us to our third paradox. If pre-living life is necessary for imagining the origins of life, then it's also the case that in the present moment, the moment of life as such, the life-non-life distinction is also untenable. When we start to think about life, we worry away at the distinction between nature and artifice. So, for example, recently there have been some new discoveries concerning beings called virions. Now, these are beings that are 10 times smaller than a virus, and they're really just a circle of RNA code. They're very, very ancient beings, and they sort of affect our transcription machinery They do things to our RNA and our DNA at an extraordinary, almost submicroscopic level. They can't really be said to be alive. I think also, you know, a virus, technically, if you think a virus is alive, I mean, a virus is a huge crystal, really. It's a macromolecular crystal that basically tells your DNA to make copies of itself. So if you think that that's alive, then you must also think a computer virus is alive, because a computer virus is also a piece of code that tells other bits of code to make copies of itself. So you can do that, but you have to concede then that computer viruses are also alive on that definition. 4. Differentiating between one species and another is never absolute. This is the lesson of Darwinism. Darwinism is truly one of the great humiliations of the human, up there or down there with Copernicus, Marx and Freud. Species, this is the origin of species here, and the funny thing is, of course, is that there's no origin as such. Species is a label that can be only applied retroactively. There are no species as such, says Darwin, no species to be, no point in evolutionary history to which we can point and say there is the origin of Homo sapiens. So even though happily they've discovered a lemur that's 47 million years old that has something like our fingernails and so on, and opposable thumbs, you can't definitively draw a line and say that's the beginning of people. Darwin really undermines the categories of species, variation, and even monstrosity, so that they all kind of deconstruct into each other, and none has priority. It's just an amazing text. I don't think modern humanists have anything to be afraid of from reading Darwin, which we should, because I don't think that we're nearly up to speed with half of what he said. So Darwin declared in a notebook that his observations of mockingbirds and turtles might undermine the stability of species. Well, that's the understatement of the millennium, isn't it? 5. There is no outside of the system of life forms. Once life gets going, we've already shown how thinking this origin is practically impossible. Everything else becomes linked with it. This is what most of us mean when we think ecologically, that everything is connected to everything else. There are strong metaphysical versions of this consequence, such as Gaian holism, and weak reductionist ones, and I'm on the weak reductionist side. This point is actually very profound because it also implies that there is no environment as such, that what we're talking about today is the phenotypical expression of DNA, and here I've been greatly influenced by Richard Dawkins' book, The Extended Phenotype. I think the ecological thought, in a way, is, imagine if Levinas and Dawkins ever met in a dark alley. They'd kill each other, wouldn't they? But my book, I'm trying to sort of provide the atmosphere, suitable lighting or whatever, nice food, good music, in which Levinas and Dawkins could go on a nice blind date and actually hit it off. And I'm using Dawkins precisely, not Gould and Lewontin, because I think that, we ought to read these people who seem conservative to us, and that if we can find progressive ways of looking at what they're doing, then how much easier it will be to find progressive philosophy and politics in work that's supposedly further to the left of that. And I like the sort of ruthless Philistine reductionism. I've got a big soft spot for that, he said provocatively. Anyway, your DNA doesn't stop expressing itself at the ends of your fingers. A beaver's DNA doesn't stop expressing itself at the ends of its whiskers, but at the ends of its dam. A spider's DNA is expressed in its web. The environment, then, from the perspective of the life sciences, is nothing but the phenotypical expression of DNA code. This includes oxygen, anaerobic bacterial excrement, and it includes iron ore, a byproduct of archaic metabolic processes. You probably drove or flew here today using crushed, liquefied dinosaur bones. You're walking on top of hills and mountains of fossilized animal bits. Most of your house dust is your skin. The environment is beginning to look like a not very successful upgrade of the old-fashioned term nature. 6. The interdependence theorem is part of the system of interdependence and is thus subject to deconstruction. This is recursivity in action. Since the interdependence theorem is also only possible to state in language, and since the interdependence theorem describes language itself, the theorem itself falls prey to its own premises. The first axiom states things are made of other things. The second axiom states things come from other things. Implication 4 asserts that we can't rigorously differentiate between one species and another. Wait a moment. In order for axiom 2 to be valid, we must be able to distinguish one species from another. Since things come from other things, there must be a distinction we can draw between one thing and another thing. Yet if we draw this distinction, that is, if we think the word distinction means something, then there's no way one species can arise from another species. A dinosaur, a bird. There's a continuity. Yet a dinosaur is not a bird. This is Zeno's paradox. Axiom 2 is in more trouble than this, because it applies readily to things that aren't life forms. Think of a candle and its flame. If there were no difference between the candle and its flame, then the flame couldn't arise, distinct from the candle. But if the candle is indeed different from the flame, then there is no way the flame can arise from it. Thus, different from and comes from are now reduced to something meagre. The very terms of Axiom 2 have shrunk. They are themselves subject to Axiom 2. Now consider Axiom 1. Things are made up of other things. Think of a car. It's made of wheels, chassis, steering wheel, windows, and so on. Where is the carness in these components? Nowhere. Yet we can't say that just any old thing will do to put a car together. A car is made of just these components, not other ones. We have reduced Axiom 1 to bareness by using Axiom 1 itself. Human beings are made up of arms, legs, heads, brains, and so on. So are duck-billed platypuses and sharks. These organs are made up of cells. So are plants, fungi, amoebae, and bacteria. These cells contain organelles. These organelles are modified bacteria such as mitochondria and chloroplasts. They themselves contain DNA. This DNA is a hybrid fusion of bacterial DNA and viral code insertions. DNA has no species flavour, moreover it has no intrinsic flavour at all. In other words, there's no daffodil flavoured DNA, but there isn't even any DNA flavoured DNA. At the DNA level, it becomes impossible to decide which sequence is a genuine one and which is a viral insertion. In bacteria there exist, for example, plasmids that are like pieces of viral code. Plasmids are kind of parasites within the bacterial host, but at this level the host-parasite duality becomes impracticable. It becomes impossible to tell which being is a parasite and which a host. We have discovered components without a device of which they are the components. We could call them organs without bodies. So, for example, fairly uncontroversially, as of 30 years ago or so, there was discovered a retrovirus in the human genome called ERV3, endogenous retrovirus 3. And this retrovirus may well code for immunosuppressive properties of the placental barrier. In other words, you're listening to this because your mum didn't spontaneously abort you because a virus in your DNA wanted to make a copy of itself. At the DNA level, the whole biosphere is highly permeable and boundaryless. How do we know that we haven't learned how to sneeze? This is Richard Dawkins' example. How do we know that we haven't learned how to sneeze? Because rhinoviral DNA codes directly for sneezing as a means to propagate itself. And yet we have bodies with arms, legs, and so on, and every day we see all kinds of life forms floating and scuttling around as if they were independent. It isn't an undifferentiated goo. 7. Since we cannot know in advance what the effects of the system will be, all life forms are theorizable as strange strangers. The interdependence theorem doesn't reduce everything to sameness. It raises everything to the level of wonder. The way things appear is like an illusion or magical display. They exist, but not that much. And how they exist is at the same time utterly unmysterious and unspeakably miraculous. I use the phrase strange stranger because Derrida's notion of the arrivant is the closest we have, as yet, to a theory of how the mesh appears up close and personal. The arrivant is a being whose arrival we can't predict, whose arrival is utterly unexpected and unexpectedly unexpected to boot. The strange stranger is not only strange, but strangely so. Uncanny, to use Freud's term. They could be us. They are us. The conclusion to be drawn from the life sciences is that we've got others, rather, they've got us, literally under our skin. Thank you very much.